In this video, you're going to learn about the upper chest and specifically how to target the upper chest in the context of a barbell bench press. So in this video, you can expect to learn what angle is best for training the upper chest, how much range of motion you should use, should you lock out or should you not, how wide or how narrow should your grip be, and all those sorts of things. So first of all, as a starting point, we need to understand how does the upper pec fully stretch and how does it shorten, and then how do we load it? It's pretty simple. That's how loading muscles in the gym works. So when we think about the upper chest, which I have represented here in blue, and honestly, many people also count the sort of highest part of the middle pecs as the upper pec. So basically this stuff up here, upper shelf, okay, is what we're talking about. How does this stuff fully stretch? Well, it's pretty simple. All we need to do is basically find a position where this upper arm bone is in line with this stuff over here, right? So if you see my upper arm is over here, you see how there's an angle from here to here. And if it's all the way too high, now there's kind of an angle going downward that way. So we want to find an arm path that is roughly parallel with all these guys over here. And on my skeleton, that looks something like this, okay? This is not a hard rule. You should take into account your individual anatomy, and I'll show you how to do that in just a second. So once you find this fully stretched position, all you have to do to know where to fully contract it is bring point A to roughly point B. I like to tell people to aim kind of for the chin, right? Because that's where those fibers are headed. So to fully shorten it, we end up somewhere over here, okay? And on me, what that would look like is I find the sort of part of my chest that's right below my inner clavicle, right here. I find that point. I feel, okay, where can I get that good stretch just sort of naturally? And then I'm gonna bring my upper arm, specifically my biceps, to that point, okay? So now here's where we start to ask questions about the specific context. What angle, how much range of motion, how wide or how narrow the grip should be, right? Because now we have the anatomy, now we just need to apply the anatomy to a specific setting, in this case, the incline press. So once we know, okay, here's our endpoint stretch, and here's our endpoint shorten, let's look at this from another angle, right? Because if we only look at it from one angle, then we're not gonna be able to actually learn how to apply this stuff. So if I know this is my full stretch somewhere here, and I know this is my full shorten, you all see how that angle is very slightly low to high, right? It's not like this. A lot of people make the mistake of assuming that because upper chest is upper, that therefore, overhead press, upper press, whatever. But the upper chest is really just slightly above the lower chest. If you consider this would be where the arm should end up with lower chest, middle chest, upper chest, it's very slightly low to high, okay? So in order to set the angle appropriately on a barbell press, you want to basically reverse engineer this whole process. Find the shortest position, as I'm showing in this demonstration here, and basically just find the angle where that shortest position ends up being 90 degrees from the floor. So in other words, you pull from point A to B like I showed you, and then you find the angle basically where your arm is in line with where the barbell is going to be pushing you directly upward and downward. If you set the angle too low, your arm is going to end up kind of over your head. And if you set the angle too high, your arm is going to end up floating over here like you're doing some kind of weird influencer exercise where the load is going downward, but where you're moving this way, okay? So that's how you find the angle. Now for me, the approximate angle that I use for upper chest is about 30 degrees. I think that if you're not confident in where to start, 30 on average is a really good place to do it. Now, the angle will change depending on how you set up, like how much arch you use or how little arch you use. Just take that into consideration. So if you arch a lot, you're probably gonna wanna put the angle a little bit higher because that's gonna move your arm up with your sternum. If you don't arch very much, on average, your angle will be lower. So on average, anywhere between 15 and 45 degrees is probably a good recommendation. Now, what about grip width and how wide or how narrow? Well, ultimately, if you've set the angle appropriately and you are using a range of motion that is comfortable for you within that angle, which is, by the way, should be the priority. Don't arbitrarily say to yourself, I need to get to this point or I need to get to this point, right? Counterproductive. Find the comfortable range for you. Find the sort of path that feels good in terms of contracting and controlling everything through the sort of upper shelf, right? You'll feel that even with light warm-up weights. And once you find that point, right, you have a sort of wiggle room, right? So there's no hard rule on how exactly narrow or how wide. What I would say is at the extremes of super wide and super narrow, you're probably sort of moving into territory that will shift the bias away from the upper chest. So find a middle ground. Start maybe somewhere in between wide and narrow at the extremes, which as a good starting point, at least for me, around 45 to 60 degrees out to the sides, and inward from there is a good place. So I typically tend to lean more toward what most people would consider a narrower grip press. Whatever you consider the thing that I'm showing you, that's typically what feels best for me. But just know that you can play around with this angle, and as a general starting point, I would recommend about 45 or so degrees away from the torso. Now, what about range of motion? You may have noticed in all of these demonstrations that I am not locking out the bar at the top position. This is for a very specific reason, which is that a majority of the bottom portion of the range, that's all gonna be chest, shoulder related stuff. But that last little bit, right, that bit from basically 60% or so of the range of motion upward, that's gonna be a lot of triceps, pretty much regardless of whether you're using a narrow or a wider grip. So this is a generalized rule across pretty much any barbell pressing variant, and even most machine pressing variants, which is basically that the lockout portion of the movement is going to be predominantly a triceps related thing. So if your goals with this exercise are just like, hey, I want to smash my upper chest, I want to smash my front delt, and I want to smash my triceps all in kind of one thing, then lock out. I would recommend locking out. If your goals, however, are hyper specific to the upper chest, and if the style of training that you prefer is more hyper specific to the muscle for each exercise, which is my personal bias and preference, just to put it out there, which is probably obvious to most of you at this point if you've been watching the channel, I would recommend not locking. So I personally don't lock out on these presses. I stay pretty far away from locking out, and that is for the specific reason that preventing the lockout will increase the proportionate amount of upper chest contribution, because you're not spending any time basically utilizing your triceps in that top portion of the motion, which would take away stimulus from the upper chest. Now, how much or how little that matters, in my opinion, comes down more to which technique allows you to be more consistent and more standardized. So even let's say if you have the goal of like being really specific to the upper chest, but you just find that not locking out is a technique that's really hard for you to get down, that's perfectly fine. Start with the lockouts and basically work toward a point where you can start to control that end range at the top, because that can be a little bit of a difficult point to sort of find and feel, at least if you're starting out with this variation and you haven't done it in a very long time. So the shorthand of that is that both variants are great exercises, but if you want to be most specific to the upper chest, I would recommend not locking. That is my personal preference. Also, just consider the fact that if you have a program where your arm day maybe follows your pressing day, so you're doing triceps on the next day, or maybe you've just done triceps on the day prior, that might be something that you want to consider, just because of the fact that if your triceps are fatigued the following day, your output may be reduced. So that's part of the reason that I personally don't do the locking thing, because I train this upper chest motion on a Monday, and on the following day on Tuesday, I train triceps. So I prefer not to have any sort of overlapping fatigue between days. That is just one example of a programming consideration relative to how you perform this variation. So overall, you have the anatomy of the upper chest. Find the stretch, find the squeeze, set the angle based on what we went over earlier, roughly 15 to 45-ish degrees as a starting point. Find and feel your arm path by basically just experimenting around with what feels most connected. Some of you will feel slightly better with a wider grip. Some of you will feel slightly better with a narrow grip. There is no hard rule around that, as long as you are sort of within that upper chest window that we discussed earlier. And in addition, and finally, with range of motion, make sure that if you want to be most upper chest specific, you don't perform the lockout portion of the motion. That's my recommendation. If you don't mind a sort of blend, or you just prefer the lockout because you like the way that it looks, cool, also fine. Just recognize that there will be a little bit less upper chest in that, and a little bit more proportionately or proportionate triceps recruitment. So I hope this video helps. If it did, check out the links in the description to learn more from me, and I'll see you all in the next video.